Good morning, and thank you to everyone for joining the webinar today. We'll take a few minutes to let everyone get into the webinar room, and we'll get started momentarily.
I got it. Can you see? I'm just trying to.
At some point, I think.
Good morning. It is 9:01 a.m. and it looks like we have about 30 people in the webinar room. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have questions for Scott or Brian or our hosts, please put them in the Q&A box. If you hover down towards the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A icon with 2 chat bubbles. Please put any questions there and we'll do our best to answer those during the webinar today. And do not use the chat for questions, please. With that, I will turn it over to Katie.
Muted. You're muted.
Katie, you're muted.
Here we go. There we go. Now we're not muted.
Good morning, everyone. We'd like to thank you for joining us this morning to talk about our favorite topic, that is Medicare ground ambulance data collection and all the fun that goes into that. But Karen and I are very happy that you've taken the time to join us this morning. And we're actually really excited about the opportunity to present Scott Moore, who is the principal of Moore EMS Consulting. He's an HR and operations consultant for the American Ambulance Association. And Brian Werfel, who is a Medicare consultant for the American Ambulance Association. Both attorneys, both very well versed. Actually, I don't think we could find anyone better to present this topic to you and stress the importance and make it fun in the process.
Exactly.
So thank you. We have 2 hours with these gentlemen, and we really encourage you. This is a great opportunity to answer any question or ask any questions that you have, and if we and we'll work together to make sure that you get all the answers that you need. And so thank you. And with that, I will turn things over to Scott to get us started.
Well, thank you, Katie and Karen. We really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to present to your clients. Certainly for a lot of folks, and I'm going to share my screen here. For a lot of folks, this is sort of the first time that they've been thrust into having to deal with, even though cost collection has been around now for quite some time, it has been delayed like most of our lives by the COVID pandemic. As Katie mentioned, my name is Scott Moore. I am a longtime EMS guy, about 31 years as an EMT. I was a call firefighter for roughly 16 years, just stopped as a call firefighter about 16 months ago during sort of mid-pandemic, but have been a lawyer also for 18 years. I'm joined by Brian Werfel, who is one of my fellow ambulance cost education faculty members. Brian has been working with the American Ambulance Association now for a very, very long time, and his father before him. If you ever find yourself in a Medicare bind, or if you ever find yourself in need of anything related to reimbursement, really on the ambulance side, Brian is, I would say, the foremost expert in the country on Medicare. For the last 24 months, we have been preparing for what we knew was coming down the line for cost collection. And so we're happy to get an opportunity to speak with you all. We know often as consultants to the American Ambulance Association, we know that it tends to be more private-based, for-profit and not-for-profit. So we don't always get an opportunity to talk with folks outside of that, get to really hit more of the fire-based EMS system. So we really appreciate the opportunity because cost collection is going to impact fire just as much as it impacts any other EMS system or provider in the country. So just as we always do, I jokingly say, always trust a lawyer who tells you not to trust or rely on what they're about to say. But just a quick disclaimer, because we are both lawyers, the AAA and its consultants and speakers do not provide legal, financial, or accounting advice. The material that we're going to give you today is informational and educational only and shouldn't be relied on as legal, financial, or accounting advice. If you do need legal, accounting, or financial advice, you should seek a licensed professional in your particular area. So, why is cost collection more important than ever? Well, we know for many of you who have just gone through the last 24 months of this pandemic, you know that many or much of the money that was made available for or to EMS providers was not really directly geared towards EMS providers. And one of the challenges that EMS has had over the last 30 years has been that we've never really done a great job at expressing what it costs to provide EMS services in this country. And in fact, one of the challenges are that because we sit somewhere in between healthcare and public safety, often we don't really have a home within the federal government, but we all rely on reimbursement generally as our major funding source for providing ambulance services. So it's important to know that CMS years ago, for those of you who don't know, the fee schedule was implemented back in the late 90s, which essentially set a rate for each level of service within or that Medicare reimbursed. Now, of course, as many of you know, a lot of the other insurers, those who are not government-based reimbursement sources, also based a lot of the way that they reimbursed us on the Medicare fee schedule. Well, this is really the first time that ambulance providers have an opportunity, or the first time the ambulance reimbursement landscape has, or it will be modified in, since the last 21 years. So, and likely for many of us, if you're, in my age range, this is probably the last time we will be around when the Medicare fee schedule is changed. So currently right now, as many of you know, we have been battling every couple of years. We go back to Congress asking them to extend the add-on payments, because there were several studies done by the GAO, both one in 2007 and one in 2013, that really suggested that EMS providers were reimbursed under what it cost them to furnish the services that they provide. Well, as a result of that, every year we'd go back into Congress and into Medicare arguing for more money. Eventually, they finally said, listen, we don't feel confident that, frankly, you're not being reimbursed appropriately. And so what we want, or what we're going to require, is for you guys to do what everybody else is required to do in healthcare, which is to provide cost reporting. Now, cost reporting, there are entire sections and departments at hospitals and other healthcare providers that are geared towards cost reporting. We felt and lobbied very hard with Medicare that for our providers to have to do a full-on cost report, that could be very, very challenging. This will be something, it would be far more detailed than the kind of cost reports or the financial reports that you have to furnish to, say, for example, Medicare at your state level. These are very, very detailed. We felt that that would be a burden, given that many of the ambulance services that we deal with just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do this. And so what we were able to get was a compromise, which was this sort of something other than cost reporting, but what's now being called ground ambulance cost data collection. So back in, I want to say, Brian, was it 2019 or 2018? 2019, they released what would be the ground ambulance, the first version of the ground ambulance proposed rules. This was going to be a cost collection instrument. What we do know is it's going to be an electronic version eventually, but for right now, they released the cost collection, the ground ambulance cost collection tool. And part of what we're going to do today is we're going to just give you a brief overview of the cost collection tool, what's going to be required, and explain to you a little bit about why this is really, really important. So they released that first tool back in 2019. Just recently, they released proposed rules back in July of 21 to modify what had been out there. So if you are currently sitting there holding a cost collection tool, the PDF version of what will be the electronic version, and it doesn't say July of 2020 on it, okay, because that's the last version. There will be a new version because of this July 21 rule. What I would say to you is you can probably toss anything prior to July 20th. So what we're going to do today is walk through, talk to you about why this is really important, what's going to be required for you and your particular service. And in particular, we want to focus on why it's critical that municipal agencies are involved in cost collection, because we have heard from a lot of folks, one, if you don't report your cost data, you're going to get a 10% penalty to your following calendar year's Medicare payment. Now, a 10% penalty may not be a huge deal for your service, but there are a whole ton of reasons why you don't want to do that. And the biggest reason being that if your organization decides not to report their data and a whole bunch of other municipal or small rural services don't report their data, the likelihood is the only folks who will report their data are those large for-profit, usually privately held organizations for whom their cost structure is highly unlikely to represent what your cost structure is. And so understand they're going to be aggregating the data. And because they'll be aggregating that data, understand that we will all as an industry be judged by the data that gets submitted, whether that is good or bad. So just to give you an idea, as I understand it, a fair number of the folks on the call today or on this presentation today have already been notified that they or know that they've been selected in years 1 or 2. Originally, the way cost collection was going to work was there was going to be 25% of the roughly 14,000 ambulance services that bill Medicare every year. 25% of those services would be selected each year over a 4-year data collection period, eventually resulting in a report that MedPAC makes to Congress in 2023, in March of 2023. So in 2019, the first year agencies were selected, and the intent was that they would collect data in 2020 and then report it in May of 21. Then in 2020, the second 25% of ambulance services were selected, the presumption being that they would have reported data or collected data in 2021 to report in 22. Of course, all of that changed when the pandemic hit. And as many of you know, cost collection was delayed. So what we're going to see, and we advocated to just push all 4 years back, but they were not agreeable to that. What we're going to see is the 2 years that have been selected right now, which are years 1 and 2, will have to collect data in 2022, and we'll have to report data by March of 2023, or 5 months following the end of your fiscal year that begins in 2022. If you haven't been picked in year 1 or year 2, you need to know that you are picked for year 3 and year 4 if your service billed Medicare. So you will be collecting, if you haven't been selected so far, you will be collecting data in calendar year or fiscal year 2023 to be reported in 2024. So you will be getting, and it may already be linked into the chat, you will be getting, actually you have been linked into the chat, thanks Sam. You will see these slides. Now all of these slides have active links to the underlying information. So if you want to take a look at the final rule, you can just click on that link. It'll take you to the final rule. The most important thing to understand is though, again, all agencies that bill Medicare, every NPI that bills Medicare over the course of the next 2 years, so starting in 22, will be reporting their cost collection data. That'll be any service regardless of the type. The new schedule for cost collection, as I said, initially the original plan was 25% of each of the ambulance services each year, reporting in 2023 to MedPAC's report to Congress. Now that's changed, of course. The downside is, one of the things that's really, really challenging is that the report that's due to MedPAC, now from MedPAC to Congress, is actually going to be, or supposed to be reported to Congress by March of 2023, which is technically before the deadline of even the first reporting entities. Because of what we're told from MedPAC, they never miss a deadline unless there's some change legislatively, which we're working on at the federal level. Right now, of course, it seems a little bit asinine that there would be a report that will have actually no data from ambulance services. So if you're not sure if you were selected, you should follow these links. You can go on to the CMS's ambulance resource page, and you can find there's zip files. Now, what I would suggest to you is these are done by state, but recognize if your billing agent is not within your state, it is entirely possible that you think that you weren't selected because you don't see your name listed in there, but in fact, you were selected. So your best bet is to search by your national provider identification number. So why are we doing all this? So just quickly to talk a little bit about actually, why don't I pass it off to Brian? Because you're probably all, lawyers, we get paid by the words. We like to use lots of them. I'm going to pass it off to Brian and he can pick up from here.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So what we're getting at really is what's at stake with cost reporting. So as Scott indicated, when the fee schedule was passed and it went into effect in 2001, almost immediately a game started where every year or two, the industry would lobby Congress to add monies to the fee schedule. And that happened almost immediately. By 2002, we had a series of temporary adjustments that added money into the fee schedule. And those have continued over time through various large spending bills. You may hear at the end of every year, we're starting it up now on the congressional schedule about a concept called extenders. These are provisions in federal spending that have expiration dates that need to be reauthorized every year or two, right? The last one for us was the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. And in that, they extended 3 temporary adjustments. So our rates for Medicare are 2% higher than they would have been if you're in an urban area, 3% higher than they would have been in a rural area. And if you're in a super rural area, and that's defined to be the bottom 1/5 by population density of all rural areas, you not only get that 3% bonus, but you get an additional 22.6%. These adjustments have been in place for over a decade now. But in the last go around, the 2018 go around, Congress made it clear that this would be the last time they extended them without actual cost data. So that's what led to the ultimate creation of this cost collection or this cost data collection regime. Now, there is some data out there on our costs. As Scott indicated, the GAO had measured our industry's Medicare payments at 2 points in the past. The most recent was a report that came out in 2013 that looked at the 2010 calendar year with the discussion or the point of determining how Medicare payments related to the average entity's costs. Now, the problem with the way the GAO did its study is it does not have the power to compel ambulance providers to report their data. Instead, it was done on a voluntary basis. So they sent out surveys to about 5% of the industry. They got back several hundred responses. And then from those responses, they came up with their conclusion. Now, here is their conclusion. The report is actually titled Ambulance Costs Vary Widely. The headline conclusion was that our rates, Medicare, with the inclusion of this 2%, 3%, and super rural bonus, is 1% above the median cost to provide the service. And without it would be 1% below costs. But when you dig in deeper in the numbers, and here's the problem, and this is why this is relevant to all of you, is they determined that the median cost to provide an ambulance service in the country was about $429. But that ranged from $224 on the low side to more than $2,200 on the high side. And when you really dig into their numbers, you also notice one other important factor, and that is this. They got back voluntary responses, and from those, they pulled out those that they believed the data was accurate enough that they could draw conclusions from it. We believe that this introduced several different biases into the analysis, primarily larger private services were more likely to provide financial statements in a way that a government actuary would understand. And that it was smaller, especially rural services and public services that were disproportionately likely to either not respond and therefore not be included in the analysis, or to have their responses thrown out as unreliable. So we know one thing with the industry: the larger you are, all things being equal, the lower your average costs, right? AMR has a lower cost structure than the average rural service with 2 trucks, right? We also know that labor is something like 70 to 75% of the average EMS agency's total costs. And we also know that those labor costs are significantly higher in the public sector portion of our industry. So again, $429 is the median, but $2,200 is the high end of their estimate for what a provider's cost might look like. The reason why we are stressing to you that it's important that you get your data in is we are fully confident that the AMRs of the world will submit their data, right? But if you don't submit your data, they are going to get a false picture of what our cost structure looks like. And when MedPAC reports, they may very well conclude that the current rates are adequate. They may even conclude that the current rates are too high and that they can be lowered, right? So if you are a relatively small service, if you are a public service, it is likely that your costs are closer to that $2,200 per trip than that $420 per trip. And if your data is not included in the analysis, they will get an unreasonably optimistic view of what costs look like. That's the big risk here, right? So in other words, it is very easy for a small service that does relatively little Medicare to look at what's being asked of them in cost reporting and say that a 10% cut for 1 year might be less than what they would actually expend to do this. And in the short term, that analysis may be absolutely right. But in the long term, they will be hurt because the industry will not receive the total funding that will be required, right? So that's why it is especially important that the public entities and the smaller entities get their data in, because they're disproportionately likely to fall on the higher end of that cost structure. So that's what, those are the risks.
And disproportionately likely to be injured by the resulting data analysis. So understand or recognize that very likely, if the AMRs of the world, and this isn't, private EMS, public EMS, there's no such thing as one's better than the other. It's just depending upon the delivery area, the system, calls for whatever type there is. So it's just important.
And what it's worth, we should probably also mention that your Medicare rates published are not the actual rates you get paid these days. There is this thing called the sequester out there that will take 2% off that Medicare rate. And initially it was for a 10-year period that was supposed to expire in 2025. It has now been pushed back to 2035 because every time Congress passes a spending bill, they either have to, the easiest way to do it is to simply push back the end date for this sequester. So they are basically refinancing their mortgage, not by paying down the principal balance, but by simply extending the maturity date outwards. And in addition, there is now a 4% cut that will be implemented. So a total of 6% will be taken off your Medicare rates as a result of the American Rescue Plan. So we need the Medicare rate themselves to be as high as possible just to help us survive, right? The cuts that are then going to be imposed on that. So next year you will get a 5.1% increase in your rates due to inflation. That sounds great, except that's compensating you for the increased cost of operating, gas, right? Labor, et cetera. You're then going to lose that immediately for this 6% cut. So we need this rate to be as high as possible. In order to get that, we need the data to show that EMS is underfunded.
Yeah, and so it's important so recognizing that what we're hoping to happen, right? First and foremost, having a systematic cost collection mechanism actually provides a lot for many of you who are looking at what's going on in the workforce right now and the struggles. One of the challenges that we're having is we're going out to Congress asking for money specifically geared at public safety and EMS. The challenge is there's just not a lot of data or information. And generally speaking, lawmakers want data. So this will be the first time in 20 some odd years that we'll have had an opportunity to reform the payment system. It opens the door for innovation. We're looking around the country, watching a lot of folks that even during the pandemic who were able to do treatment in place and get reimbursed for that, doing some telehealth. This is an opportunity. We know as EMS providers that we bring a lot more to the table than just simply running out, providing some EMS and transporting people to the hospital. There are a lot of opportunities for evolution of what's happening in EMS. Also, again, if you are on today, I applaud you for being on, but recognize that you likely know 10 folks who aren't on, who are never going to engage. It is critical that those folks engage in this process because, again, we will be judged by the worst data. And another thing is recognizing that if there's a very low response rate, one, not only will those folks get penalized, but number two, it does send a message to CMS, does send a message to Congress that the rates are adequate. And as such, there's no need for them to continue to take a look at what occurs. One of the other and last things I'll say is recognize that when there's an old saying that says, when data is like trash, if you're going to collect it, you sure as heck better know what's going to happen with it. Recognize that if the data comes back that the costs are actually lower than what Medicare is reimbursing, as Brian had mentioned, it's entirely possible that those numbers, that our reimbursement rates go down. And on top of that, they're not the only ones determining, there will be other private insurers who will take a look at this cost study, and we stand potentially to get impacted on the private side as well. So one of the reasons why EMS never gets a ton of attention in the federal government, as you can see here, it is less than it is 0.083% of the national healthcare spend. So we represent a very, very small chunk of the total healthcare expenditure. So we're not going to get a lot of attention. And as we mentioned earlier, 85% of the ambulance services that bill Medicare each year for transports bill less than 2,500 transports a year. 75% bill less than 1,000. And I think it's something like 50%, Brian, if I'm not mistaken, that bill less than, I want to say 500 trips. So the majority of the ambulance providers in this country are small, rural and super rural providers, or they're generally just not transporting a lot of folks. That means, again, as you look behind me, there's a picture of a New Yorker article that was about volunteer services that are closing, and rural services, super rural services are closing because they can't continue the funding. It's important to recognize that, again, while a lot of EMS occurs in the cities, outside of the cities, there is really a very, very difficult, very strained network of ambulance providers trying to provide service as well as fire-based systems. Again, if you do not make an intentional plan to succeed with cost collection and to do this process, I can promise you it will not be done well and your results will be terrible. Now, just as we talked about, the tool that CMS has published that is up here in the chat, that is a paper or a PDF version of what will be an electronic version. So there will be it'll be an electronic cost collection tool being developed right now by CMS and their contractor RAND, who will be is making the tool the electronic version. Now, what we don't want is for the first time that folks start to work or submit their data electronically to be on game day when you're actually submitting that information. So sort of knowing that a lot of services haven't had an opportunity to utilize any sort of cost. When I talk to folks and we say, what about pulling it from your payroll system or from your CAD? We were doing presentations in some of the rural parts of Vermont where they were like, we don't even have a computer-aided dispatch system. So one of the things that the AAA did was invested some money to build and have developed. They hired a contractor, so there's a firewall. AAA cannot see the individual data that gets submitted into Amber. Amber is a cost collection platform, a web-based cost collection platform developed by a third-party contractor specifically for the purposes of cost collection and starting to allow ambulance services to work with a cost collection tool. So it is designed very similar to what we believe the underlying or the ultimate tool that CMS will produce. We've showed the tool to CMS. They like it a lot. And what we're trying to convince them to do is to allow for an application program interface or some communication so that if you spend time and commit time to submitting your data into Amber, that you then don't have to go ahead and submit it all over again when your time to do cost collection comes up. We're hoping that they will work with us. They like Amber. They think it's a great tool. They like many of the features in Amber. So we're working with them on that. If you are, if you are a SAVIC member, so the SAVIC Foundation, SAVIC is a group or cooperative purchasing group. And so if you are a SAVIC member, membership is free. You become a SAVIC member and you can go on to the AAA's website and you can apply for a cost collection grant. So the foundation and the AAA have agreed that this is so important that they're pooling money to make Amber free and accessible to any ambulance provider, regardless of the provider type, whether you're municipal, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, doesn't matter. So become a SAVIC member, apply for the grant, then you get access to Amber. And this way you can start to frame out your cost collection process, and you're not simply scrambling when the time comes. While many billing agents have offered to handle cost collection for you, recognize that there are a lot of parts of cost collection that no matter who's handling it for you, you're still going to need to engage. So again, go to SAVIC, become a member, go to the AAA's website, apply for the grant, and you will get access to Amber free of charge. Now, before we get, we're trying to make sure that we stay on schedule because there's a lot to cover. But just quickly, I want to give credit to CMS where credit is due here. They have done an unbelievable job at putting together education and material content for you. In particular, also not just presenting it like it's for private ambulance services, but really have some great stuff for municipal ambulance services. So lots of educational programs. They have regular open door forums or presentations that you could do. If you've never been to the CMS Ambulance Services Center, you should go to the CMS Ambulance Services Center. When you click on those active links in the presentation regarding who was selected when, you will find it'll take you to this page. So if you, and by the way, Samantha was kind enough to bring up the cost collection grant application link is right in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance, you don't have to do it now because you should be paying attention, right? You should do it following the program. But CMS has done an amazing job. So go on here, you will find everything that you need to know about cost collection. In addition, of course, the AAA has got a ton of content relative to cost collection. So I'm going to hit this first section of the tool, and then I'll pass it off to Brian for the second, and we'll just keep, dropping back and forth. So the tool, this is the paper version of the tool. I believe now that there is a final rule following the July 21 proposed rule, we will probably see an updated version of the tool relatively soon. I didn't see anything on there this morning when I went on, but this PDF version of the tool is a little bit hard to read through because there are some bracketed sections that are geared towards identifying or letting you know that this is intended to be, when electronic, it will use skip logic. And what skip logic is if you've said you're a municipal-based fire department early on in the start of this program, it will then only put questions relative to fire-based EMS. If you said you were a private-based EMS and you have no public safety responsibilities, well, then you won't see questions relative to public safety, which is a good thing, right? Because oftentimes when we see these surveys, we get confused because we see a question that really doesn't apply to us. In this instance, if you've answered the tool right as you work your way through the tool, and you see a question that doesn't apply to your organization, it should tell you that you likely answered a question wrong somewhere earlier in the tool. All right, so in this PDF version, as I said, a little confusing, just kind of to the extent that you can read it without having to read through the bolded bracketed stuff. This is just a printed version of what the electronic tool will be. It is 13 sections and is 45 pages. So the first section is really just general survey instructions, organizational characteristics, and we'll talk about what that is: service area, emergency response time, ground ambulance service volume, service mix, labor costs, which we know are the largest costs in any ambulance service, facilities and vehicles costs, equipment, consumables and supplies, other costs, total cost, and then the last section, which really is the easiest section, is revenue. So this first section really is geared at, understand that what we're looking to do is make sure that your organization is compared to other like organizations. We don't want a municipal-based fire-based EMS system or service being compared to a private-based EMS service. We want to make sure that you end up in the right bucket for data aggregation and for comparison. So here, again, the first questions will be essentially, one, they're looking for just your NPI information. So in other words, if you have multiple NPIs, which I'm going to presume most of you on here don't, which is typically for folks who own several companies. But if you have just one NPI, you're being selected for that one NPI. If you have more than one, you need to separate out costs between the two NPIs. What they're going to ask you are, do you bill Medicare for ground ambulance services? If the answer is no, well, then your survey is done. And in fact, actually, you shouldn't have been selected in the first place. They're referring to the ground ambulance organization. So in other words, that NPI, again, if you are not a ground ambulance service that bills Medicare, you shouldn't be in here. They say that this tool should take about 20 hours to basically review the instructions, amass the data, about 3 hours to input that data. I honestly don't think that that is even close to accurate. So if you haven't, and your billing service should be able to do this for you, and I'm sure they have already, PECOS, which is the Provider Enrollment Chain of Ownership System. In the old days, you filled out forms. Now you go on PECOS. PECOS is where you should check to make sure that your information is up to date and accurate. Because if you, let's say, for example, were selected and you didn't get notified, that could be one of the reasons the information in there is not accurate. So they are going to ask you questions about, did you bill for ground ambulance services? What's the ownership structure of your organization? How many NPIs do you have? Who's the organizational contact? In other words, if they have questions about your cost collection survey, who should they contact? And they want to know whether you're on a calendar or fiscal reporting year. Now, if your organization has been selected, you are supposed to, within 30 days of being selected, notify your Medicare intermediary. So you should notify them of whether your organization runs on a calendar or a fiscal year. If you haven't done that, don't panic. You can contact your intermediary and you should be able to tell them now. Because of the delay, that should be perfectly fine. Now, they're going to ask you what type or what best describes your organization. Are you for-profit, a not-for-profit, but non-governmental? Are you a governmental, or are you a public-private partnership? That's just, again, to make sure that you end up in the right bucket. Now they're going to ask you, as I said, the responses to this early part of the tool will set up the remaining questions that you see. So if you are a shared services model, that would be those who do more than just provide ambulance services. So if you're a hospital-based system or you're a fire-based EMS system, then you are going to be a shared services model. We are not looking for air providers in this particular cost collection tool. So if you are an organization that does both air and ground, your ground part may have been selected and they only want information tied to your ground ambulance service, not any part of your air. From what we understand, there will be another cost collection piece for the air side. They're going to ask if you use volunteers, because if you use volunteers, that certainly impacts your cost, given that in most agencies, about 70 to 75% of their overhead is related to wages, benefits, and or labor related costs. So they want to make sure that even if you are a volunteer agency, you still have an obligation to report your cost data. They're going to ask if you do 911, non-emergency, or both. So again, because the cost structures for emergency providers or non-emergency providers tend to be different. They will ask what your hours of operation are. And then this last thing, they're going to ask about paramedic intercepts. While we all refer to when an ALS truck intercepts a BLS truck as a paramedic intercept, that's not what we're referring to here. This only applies for providers in New York, the state of New York. So for all of you on here, you may have instances in which a paramedic truck intercepts a BLS truck. That is a joint response for purposes of cost collection. It may not be what you call it when you're out on the road, but for purposes of cost collection, that's a joint response. Only New York area providers use or have what's called a paramedic intercept. That's a CMS term of art. So does your organization provide any or all the following services? And they're going to ask you to select, and that'll be whether it's fire, air, right? So again, they're looking to identify if in fact you do more than just ambulance services, you're going to need to carve out those costs that are either entirely or partially related to ground ambulance. The other cost will not be reported in here, okay? So now they are going to be looking for ground ambulance labor costs, these are sort of all of the buckets of costs that are there that make up your total cost. This comes right out of the August 12th Open Door Forum. If you want to go back and watch that program, what they're trying to identify here is we're looking for all of your costs related either entirely or partially to ground ambulance. So they're recognizing that some of those may be, right, in that green section are the ground ambulance costs, in the blue section, those are your total costs. So if you're a fire-based system and you have costs that are related directly to ground, but then you have a whole bunch of other costs that are your organization's total cost, CMS is only looking for the cost in that green section. So I'm going to pass it off. Again, coming back to that last section, that's more about making sure you end up in the right bucket and that your data is analyzed with other like type providers. So I'm going to pass it off to Brian to hit sections 3 and 4.
All right. So just as a reminder, everything we've talked about up until this point in that section 2 is really laying the groundwork for the specific questions that you will answer later, starting here in sections 3 and 4. So the reason why we didn't go into much detail in any of those items above is because each of them will be discussed again in their proper bucket as we go down here through the various specific items. So the first specific item is section 3, which is talking about your service area. So a couple of defined terms we got to get out of the way. First is whether or not you are the primary emergency ambulance provider in most or all of your primary service areas. So here they're talking about, or they're getting at the 911 response concept. So your primary service area is focused on you, not necessarily a geographic area. So it's looking at your organization, and it's the area in which you are exclusively or primarily responsible for providing services, and where the majority of your transports, the pickup will likely occur. So it is entirely possible that 2 ambulance companies can have primary service areas that overlap with one another, right? To use an easy example, it is likely the case that multiple organizations will have their primary service area as being the Cleveland metropolitan area. So look at this from your perspective. If you have primary 911 responsibilities in a designated area, it may be a county, it may be a city, it may be a portion of a city, right? That's what we would list as our primary service area. And then it asks, within that primary service area, are you the primary emergency ambulance provider, meaning the 911 entity, right? Okay, so with respect to the service area, and I realize I got to move the slides here. There we go. All right. It's also going to ask you about any secondary service areas that you have. A secondary service area is an area in which you are not primarily responsible for providing ambulance services, but where you might be obligated to provide those services either under a mutual aid agreement, an auto aid agreement, or some other area. It's also not, secondary service areas are not getting at those areas to which you may respond only under exceptional circumstances. So for instance, if you agreed to deploy under a FEMA deployment to say the Gulf Coast to help out with the hurricane, you would not list that area. It's not a secondary service area because those are one-off instances where you would respond. A secondary service area is generally going to be the town over, right? Where you're not the primary 911 response agency, but where you have an understanding with the primary responder there that if they can't handle the call, you would come in and do it, right? So We want to be as restrictive as possible on our primary service area. Then we use the secondary service areas to cover those other areas in which you do routinely do work, but certainly it's not a dated, it's not an everyday occurrence, right? Next, it's going to ask you about average trip time. Now, average trip time is defined to be the time from which the ambulance begins its response until the time in which it's able and available to respond to another call. So this is not when you've dropped the patient off in all instances. So when you're in your primary service area, generally speaking, your vehicle is available to respond to the next call as soon as it's cleared the current call, right? However, if in your situation, it is not unusual for you to transport patients outside of your primary service area because the nearest hospital is located outside your primary service area, then what we would have to account for is the deadhead time coming back into your primary service area where you can then respond to that next call. So there is no good answer to this question in the sense of 5 minutes is a good time, 10 minutes is a bad time. This is going to be very specific to your particular situation, right? And then they're going to ask you to answer this average trip time, both for those within your primary service area and your secondary service area. Now, why are they asking these questions? Well, what they're trying to get at is the cost of readiness. Many of these questions will relate to cost of readiness. Cost of readiness is something that we all understand intuitively in the industry, but which it is very difficult to sort of define and even more difficult to quantify the actual costs associated with it, right? The reason why they want to get at it is ultimately they are going to be responsible for determining whether or not your particular situation is a situation where you are staffed at the appropriate level of service to provide a reasonable level of care to your community, or whether or not you have made a conscious decision to have an overabundance of resources, right? In which case, yes, your cost structure would be higher. And from their perspective, that would not be something that would be reasonable for you to be reimbursed for. One of the ways they get at that is to look at your average trip time. If your average trip time is higher than your neighbor, then all things being equal, your costs of readiness are higher because it requires more vehicles for you to maintain the same number of responses. Because at any given time, one or more of your vehicles will be outside your primary service area, right? So this is what they're getting at indirectly. Emergency response time. Now they're going to ask you for the time on your emergency response times. This they're measuring from the time the call comes in to when the ambulance or the other EMS response vehicle, so if you respond with a fire truck, it would measure it to that time, actually arrives on scene. So be mindful of how calls are dispatched in your area, right? It may be the case that the call goes directly when I pick up the phone and dial 911 to you, in which case we're going to measure from when you receive the call until when your vehicle arrives on scene. If it's the case, though, that it goes into a PSAP and the PSAP then rolls it over to you, we would need to account for that time when the call is still at the PSAP, right? This is measured from the patient's perspective. How long, on average, after I pick up the phone to dial 911 before that first emergency vehicle responds to my door, right? Then it is going to ask you whether or not you are subject to any response time mandates or incentives. And if so, who determines those requirements? Meaning, and then it will also ask whether or not you're penalized for failing to meet them. So again, why are they asking this? Well, if your agreement with your municipality obligates you to maintain an 8-minute response time, then you have to allocate the appropriate number of vehicles to maintain that response time. If by contrast, the municipality is comfortable with a 15-minute response time, but internally you've decided that you'd rather maintain an 8-minute response time, right? Then in theory, you might have more vehicles than the municipality is necessarily mandating. That's an internal decision. It's not a mandate or a requirement, and they would treat that differently in determining what the average costs are or the appropriate costs are, right? So again, we're going to answer this based on whether or not you have response time criteria, and then whether or not they're determined by you or under an agreement with the municipality. Now, I realize that many of you are municipal providers, and here the area gets a little bit gray. I think the better way to answer it as a municipal fire department is whether or not the city has the response time criteria. I realize that you are, in many cases, part of that same government that determined that response time. But from your perspective as the fire department, you don't really have a choice. So I would answer it as if it is a mandate and not an internal target.
Yeah, one of the things that I'd say is, we often sort of joke that you can have an EMS system, good, fast, or cheap, pick two. What they're looking to get to in this particular instance is, we know that time is money. So if in fact the response time criteria is 6 minutes or 8 minutes or 12 minutes in your particular area, a certain percentage of time, so it's 8 minutes, 59 seconds, 90% of the time, well, that cost is X. Now, if it's 8 minutes and 59 seconds, 100% of the time, that cost is likely X times 100, right? Because it's that last 10% of the time when, in fact, in order to catch and make sure that you make all those responses within that time, it's considerably more expensive. So what they're looking to understand is, what is your average response time? And by the way, is that required, or are you required to hit certain parameters because of something you've said or something that your community has set or you've agreed to as a function of an RFP or something to that effect? Now, do you want me to pick up from here, Brian, or do you want to?
Oh, keep going. You got it.
All right. So on the next part, ground ambulance service volume, what they're looking to do is understand what are your total number of responses. So that's total number of requests for ground ambulance service, whether you ever deployed a resource or not, right? So in other words, if you got a call, 911 call, or a call, whether it be 911 or not 911, but you got a call in your system for a request for ground ambulance, whether or not you ever actually deployed an ambulance, but you received a request for a response, that's what they're looking for there. Then, or if, for example, you dispatched a fire truck that also provides some EMS support, and another ground ambulance came in from a neighboring community, that again would be a response. So the one thing that's really important for folks to know, though, is if you sent out 2 ambulances to one call, let's say it was a call where it was believed there'd be multiple patients, and ultimately you only transported one patient, that's only one response. Even though you dispatched 2 ambulances, it's one response. If you dispatched, let's say, 2 ambulances, a ladder, and an engine, and there were no patients, that's still one response. So this is one part that I don't love, because I think it's important to recognize that the number of apparatus, the number of equipment that's been dispatched is certainly related to cost. However, we have seen around the country, a lot of times I'll see articles or get complaints from folks that said, geez, I just wanted an ambulance, but I got a police, 2 police cars, an engine, a fire rescue truck, and a private ambulance.
Sorry.
Again, that comes down to, a lot of times the way EMS is a system, and folks tend to forget that. It's not just the ambulance that's providing EMS. It's actually part of a larger system. So what we're looking for is their total number of responses or your request for responses. And then what they're looking for is a subset of that information, which is total number of ground ambulance responses. And now it's important to know, right, that is a fully equipped, staffed ground ambulance for scheduled or unscheduled, with or without transport, with or without payment. If one or more vehicle is sent, that again counts as one. Now it has to be an ambulance as defined by Medicare. I know in my state, Massachusetts, we have what's called the Class 5 ambulance. That's an ambulance that, while it may be staffed, could be staffed by one person, actually doesn't or can't transport a patient. That is not, while it may be licensed as an ambulance in Massachusetts, it is not a ground ambulance per Medicare guidelines. Medicare guidelines mean fully staffed, fully equipped, able to transport a patient. So what they're looking for is, if again, you send 2 ambulances out of the firehouse because there's a bad car wreck, and it turns out there's only one patient, that's one response, which again, I don't feel is a great way to measure it, but at least, frankly, it certainly could be worse. So then next they're looking for your ground ambulance transports versus your ground ambulance paid transports. So what they're going to ask you for is how many transports did you perform by ground ambulance? And then how many of those did you get paid for, whether in full or in part? All right. So again, this is why we're talking to you about this now, or because we recognize that many of you may not have systems built in place to ensure that you can capture this information. If you were asked to do it for last year today, that would be really problematic because you'd have to go back and try and, the systems aren't set up. They don't understand what you're looking for. As we go back to, the ability to respond, if you had transported a patient, to the next state and they clear the hospital, but they're not actually able to respond yet, there's still, that truck is not available to you, and that is part of your cost. So building and making sure that your dispatch system is set up to capture those times when your truck, while it may be clear the hospital, may not be available to respond. If you do that now, that's going to set you up to more accurately report your information. Let's go back to ground ambulance transports versus paid transports. Again, recognizing how many transports did you have versus how many did you actually get paid for in full or in part. Again, they're looking for the total number of responses in the reporting year that a ground ambulance was deployed. This is a bit repetitive. And then your total ground ambulance responses in that report year. So ground ambulance service volume, they are going to ask for your responses with a non-transporting agency. In other words, does your organization respond to calls with another non-transporting agency, such as a local fire department, et cetera? Ground ambulance responses in the secondary service area, they're going to ask what percentages of your ground ambulance responses occurred in your secondary service area. Then lastly, ground ambulance services. So in other words, your dry runs. So how many times did you dispatch a ground ambulance and then not result in transport? And then they'll ask for your total ground ambulance transports. Again, a lot of this is very repetitive. And frankly, you should be able to pull this information right out of your either computer-aided dispatch system or from your E911 software, however it is that your organization is set up. So they're going to look, so ground ambulance paid transports, what they want to know is of the transports that you did in the reporting year. So if you're reporting next year, you're collecting data in 2022, what they're going to want to know is of the transports that you did in, let's say it's calendar year 2022, by the time that you submit your report to CMS. So you have until May of 23 to submit your report. What they want to know is of those transports by your reporting time, how many of those were paid transports in part or in whole. All right. So there was some confusion on this as to whether if you happen to collect money in 2022 from, let's say, old VA trips that you had done a year earlier, that's not what they're looking for. What they're looking for is of the trips that you transport in the data collection year, by the time you report, which is roughly 5 months following that year, you should know pretty well whether you got paid for the majority of those trips. There'll be the outliers that you haven't been paid for by that point.
Scott, I think we should probably pause here and talk briefly about accounting. Because if we mention it later, people are going to just drop off because no one wants to hop on a webinar and talk about accounting. So this is one of those areas where how you account for things will either make your life substantially more difficult or substantially easier. So while they tell you when we get into revenues that you should use your normal accounting, meaning if you're an accrual-based system, you should report on an accrual basis. And if you're a cash-based system, you should report on a cash basis. It is clear that they've sort of designed it with cash basis in mind, right? So if you do use accrual, a lot of people accrue the revenue on the date in which they perform the transport, or at the latest, the date at which they actually submit the bill. You're going to have to essentially convert that into cash, meaning when did you get the money, in order to report on when these trips were paid, whether or not it occurred within the period or not. So just be mindful of how you account for your payments, because it will impact how this data looks. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Okay, so on that, with that regard, so just important to recognize that you're going to, and your billing agency is going to take care of you. Your billing agent has been engaged in this process since the beginning. So it's important to recognize that they should be able to furnish a lot of this information, for or to you. In fact, there have not been many billing agents who have been so sort of forward thinking that they're actually hosting their own platform. But that being said, we'll keep moving along. So the next thing that they're going to ask you for is, how many standby events did you do? The paramedic intercept thing, as I said, that is in New York. And then how many ALS joint responses? So the ALS joint response is when your service responded where you received ALS from another service. So in other words, another service came in and provided ALS for your underlying BLS trip. So,
Whoops, Scott, sorry.
ahead.
I don't mean to correct
No,
you. I think
please.
they're actually asking where you are the ALS responding entity.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
You're the BLS transporting entity that will be accounted for in the transports, right? This is asking for those situations where you're responding and not transporting, even if you didn't send an ambulance.
yeah. So this is why Brian's here. Brian's the safety net under my little high wire act. Even though we've been doing this for 4 years, it is entirely possible, especially if you don't have your notes in front of you, to get it wrong. But no, I appreciate that, Brian. Yeah. So in this instance, how many times did you, if you're a BLS service only, then this question shouldn't appear for you. All right. Ground ambulance responses. We've sort of already hit that, but they're going to be looking by the type: BLS, ALS1, or ALS2. All right. So that for provided an immediate response to a call. An immediate response is defined by Medicare. So that's essentially you received the call and you made or took immediate action just to begin response. Unless, Brian, you've got a better or different definition.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear from their sort of discussion on this that what they want to make sure is that when you look at various different payers, that you're applying the same standards of what is an emergency or a non-emergency consistently. This particularly becomes an issue in those states where Medicaid does not distinguish between an ALS emergency and an ALS non-emergency, and therefore requires you to use a certain code for both, right? They want to make sure that you're using Medicare's definitions for all of the responses, right? So in Ohio, I believe that Medicaid does distinguish between emergent and non-emergent at the various base levels. So what really this is just reporting straight from your billing reports, which claims were billed with an emergent response versus a non-emergent response. So we're really just summing up the sum total of all the various base rates you've billed here.
Yeah, and that will include those going from a lower acuity entity, healthcare facility, to a higher acuity organization. So folks oftentimes will say, geez, you can't do an emergency out of an ED. The fact of the matter is you absolutely can do an emergency out of an ED. So you'll want to make sure that you can capture that. Again, this is the importance of setting your system up on the front end so that you can ensure that you're capturing the data accurately. All
right.
right.
You already do this because you would bill for the emergent base rate when appropriate in those instances. So really, we're just going to track how you bill for this section.
Yep.
Next section, Scott, if you want to hop over, this one, we can give you an answer right now. You are 100% land ambulance. Water ambulance does not mean a situation where you use a boat to facilitate a response into ground. It is a concept that exists only in the state of Alaska. So unless you're dialing in from the far north here, you are 0% water and 100% land.
Yep. And then they're going to go ahead.
You got it, Scott.
Okay. So then they're going to ask you about your total transports by category. So that'll again be, and this would be something that you should be able to get right from your billing company, will be the BLS non-emergency, BLS emergency, ALS1 non-emergency, ALS1 emergency, ALS2, and then SCT. That you should be able to get pretty easily right from your billing service or internally from your own billing software. Those response categories or those transport categories, again, are listed as they are listed in the Medicare definitions. So ALS1, ALS2, BLS, specialty care. And then they will ask you about interfacility transports. My understanding is most of the folks on this are fire-based. And while it is not impossible for fire-based services to do interfacility transports, however, again, what they're trying to get an idea of how often are you going from one healthcare facility to another healthcare facility. So, and this again comes back to making sure that you get costs. So labor, section 7. So we're, this is really the largest section of the entire tool. and one of the more challenging sections of the tool, because they're only looking for those personnel that are either entirely or partially related to ground ambulance. So if you have someone in fire permits or fire inspectional services that does not respond to a ground ambulance call at any point during the year, we're not talking about that individual, he or she. We're not interested in that, all right? We're not also looking for any contractors. The important thing to remember are they break labor down into 3 categories. All right, so they largely say in an ambulance service, there are 3 categories of folks. Those EMT response staff, those who are administrative or facility staff, and then a medical director. So if at any point in the year, an individual in your department or your agency responded to a ground ambulance call or a ground ambulance response, that person, regardless of their position, will have all of their hours and all of their compensation reported in the EMT response staff. So if you have a fire chief who did 1 ambulance call during the period, the data collection period, that person's entire wages and their entire benefits and hours get reported in the EMT response staff. Now, if in fact you have admin staff or facility staff, fleet maintenance folks, you have dispatchers, you have billers, HR people, those folks will be in your admin facility staff. So again, if you have people who are your ambulance biller, but happen to run 1 ambulance call over the course of the data collection period, that individual is reported in the EMS response staff. The other thing that's important to know, and this did get unusually complicated for no reason, because you're going to report hours and wages. Why they did this, I really don't know. But what they've decided is, if I start out the data collection period as an EMT, and then 3 or 4 months into my year, or even 1 month into my year, I make the change over to be a paramedic, all of my wages and hours will be reported as an EMT. So while I say they break the categories into 3 broad categories, you are going to report EMT, paramedic wages. So if someone started the year as an EMT and became a paramedic, or went the other direction, started the year as a paramedic and became an EMT, you are going to report their entire wages and hours in the category that they were in on the day the data collection period started. It would have been 10 times easier just to pull a report out of your payroll software and your scheduling software for all paramedic hours and all paramedic wages, or all EMT. But for whatever reason, so this is the importance of knowing as you start the reporting year, that you sort of take a snapshot at that time and make sure that you lock that person's wages and hours for reporting purposes in the appropriate category. So I see a little quick QA come up here. What do you do if you hire someone midway through the year? Do you include them? Yes, great question. So if you add staff during the course of the year, let's say you get about June and you hire an EMT, that EMT's wages will get picked up starting in June through the end of the reporting year. Now, if that EMT gets picked up in June and then in August becomes a paramedic, you will report all of that individual's wages and hours in as an EMT starting in June all the way through. That is a real pain. I have to tell you, I don't like it, but that's the way it's got to be set up. So you need to make sure that you've got your system and your processes. One thing I didn't say at the beginning that I should have, you should make sure that you start to document how you're going to comply with these standards. So in other words, this reporting requirement, have a procedure for cost collection, because while this is set right now to be a 2-year process covering 100% of the industry that bills Medicare, recognize that I am confident that this is not the last time we will have to report cost. In fact, I believe it is the first of what will be a regular and ongoing process. There's nothing that they say that's going to be it, but my gut is once they start collecting data, they're going to want more of it. That being said, we're also going to benefit pretty substantially, I think, from collecting data, because we can also use that data. One of the advantages to using Amber is that we'll start to, while de-identified, won't know who submitted the information, we will start to be able to prepare if the data doesn't look good, number one, or number two, is really not telling the story that we think it was going to tell, we can start to prepare both, offensively, but then again, defensively. So in that EMT response staff, another question, how can we prorate distribute HR payroll costs based upon employee count? Oh, well, I guess the question is, are you saying, can we prorate or distribute payroll costs based upon employee count? You're supposed to be using, from employee count, you should be using actual data on your total wages and your total hours. So in other words, all compensation, I'll cover what that is in a minute, and then all hours for each type of each of these positions listed here again, right? You'll see it in the report in the cost collection instrument, and you can flip to that section right now. It's in section 7. You're going to see where you're going to need to report total EMT hours, total EMT wages. That will be broken up not only, and we'll get there in a second, between those who have public safety responsibilities and those who don't have any public safety. So you're going to need to be able to have or ensure that your reporting systems right now have the ability to pull total hours by position and total compensation in addition by position. So I'm not sure I answered that question. If I didn't, please sort of restate it or try and make it a little bit clearer. I'm not sure I'm answering that, but just so I'll keep an eye out in the QA for that. But on the EMT response staff, that includes basically anybody who responded to a ground ambulance call during the course of that reporting year. So EMTs, paramedics, emergency medical responders, ambulance drivers. I know a lot of people don't like that term, but there are actually people who are certified ambulance drivers, firefighter EMTs, paramedics, a fire chief EMT, fire chief paramedic. My fire department, we had a fire chief who happened to be a paramedic and regularly went on ambulance calls. So if you're in a small department where everybody, even the person who's doing time cards and billing, actually is a EMT or paramedic and responds to calls, well, then you may very well be in a position where all of your data relative to payroll or labor is only reported in one category, EMT/response staff. They will be able to figure out that clearly you have administrative costs, and they'll be able to identify that. And I'll show you how in a minute. So your admin facilities folks include your dispatchers. Now, if you have dispatchers who also responded to a ground ambulance call, that's pretty common too. People who work, I know a lot of times the fire departments, they'll rotate people through dispatch, or you have folks who may do both street time and dispatch time. If they responded to one ground ambulance call, they get put into the EMT response staff. All right, dispatch supervisors, call takers, receptionists. Now, if your organization doesn't have any, let's say, for example, you don't have any dispatch, another entity does the dispatch for you, well, then you don't have any dispatch cost related to that unless you pay for that, in which case then we'll show you where that goes somewhere else in the tool. That's not reported in labor. Labor is only those people who are W-2 employees, okay? Receptionists, billers, fleet mechanics, account payable, custodians, logistics, vehicle service techs, etc. Those are all in the admin and facility staff. Then your medical director, whether that be an employed or a volunteer medical director. Now here, we're not talking about the people who are, for example, your affiliate medical director, who you may, for example, pay a hospital to have an affiliate medical director. What they're looking for here is, does your service have an employed or a volunteer medical director? Someone who, while a volunteer, could still be an employee. And our volunteers are still employees while they may not get paid. So there is, and this comes right out of the Medicare Learning Network, there is an entire, they've done a great job, and they have wonderful webinars on there and a lot of really great material. I strongly suggest you go, in particular with staffing. Not only did they do a lot on just staffing for non-public safety based EMS organizations, but they have a lot, I think now 2 different presentations on public safety based EMS systems. So really strongly suggest that you go to the Medicare webpage, the Ambulance Services Center. So they will have a checklist here, and this is right from the tool. Sorry, it's easier actually here than it is when we're doing these live, because often these slides are so small. I'm sorry. So on table under 7.2 for administrative, would you list 0 hours for ground ambulance since they do not go on the runs? Let me go back and see if I'm not thinking about this correctly. So, oh, I'm sorry, you're looking at the actual tool. So if you have individuals who are administrative staff who do not go on ground ambulance calls, right? So you have folks who have on ground ambulance, you would list, if you have administrative staff, those folks get listed in the administrative staff category and not in the ground ambulance category, okay? So if you have folks who are administrative staff who also go on ground ambulance calls, then you may very well have nothing listed in the administrative staff because all of those folks also happen to go on ground ambulance calls. That's perfectly normal. That happens all the time. But so I'm not sure if I'm answering that question correctly, but so admin staff are those people who never, ever respond to ground ambulance calls. They could be EMTs, but if in the period of the collection period, they never go on a ground ambulance response, then you would report them in the administrative category. So here, this is directly from the tool. All right. Here it's going to ask you, and this is a checkbox. This is setting you up to answer questions down the line. Do you have on the EMT response staff, EMT basics? If you say yes, the first column says paid staff without public safety roles, volunteer staff without public safety roles, or paid staff with public safety roles, or volunteer staff with public safety roles. So you check whichever one applies as you work through this checkbox. This checkbox, based upon how you respond, you will then only get questions that are applicable to your agency because you've responded in a way. So if you say, we are, let's say, for example, you're only a private ambulance service that does not use volunteer labor, does not do fire, does not do police. You would say, I am a paid staff without public fire, police, public safety roles, and you would list BLS, intermediate, or in this case, you would use advanced. Paramedic, if you had a nurse or a doctor, emergency medical responder, ambulance driver, then as you get down, medical director. Again, some people have medical directors who actually still respond on ambulance calls. If you have a medical director that responds on an ambulance call, then in my opinion, that is an EMT response staff. All right. Administrative facilities, administrative, clerical, etc. That's, you'll go through, you'll check off this box. Now they've provided you with a really good labor checklist. We like algorithms in EMS. Most of our protocols are algorithmic based. And so here we are a volunteer department. Don't mind me, I'm gonna jump. I have an attention span of a housefly, sorry. We are a volunteer department, but pay those who go on responses a stipend for each run they go on. Should that be reported as paid staff or volunteer staff? Great question, and I'm going to answer that in just a minute. All right. So you'll go through this algorithm. This is from the Medicare Learning Network, the staffing and labor cost that was done on February 6th of 2020. They have this great algorithm that'll walk you through how, and you should grab your entire list of staff and you should work through this algorithm with each individual. All right. That way, and you should identify them. What I would say is if you have a staffing software, let's say, for example, a scheduling software, if there is a spot in many of the scheduling softwares there are where you can provide a code so that you can make sure that you are identifying, you can run a report on those folks later to make sure that you're only pulling, let's say, for example, hours of individuals who fit in the right category of folks, okay? Now, here is where you will, in the next section, they want you to do your total hours and dollars by category. Now, I'm going to tell you what is included in compensation in a minute, but just for the purposes of this, you're going to go through and you are going to fill out. Now, by the way, if you said you had no paramedics, well, then paramedics won't appear here. All right. So EMT basic without public safety role, how much dollars did you pay? And we'll talk about compensation and what to include in a minute. And how many hours did they work? And then if they had hours that were unrelated to ground ambulance. So for example, if you have ambulance, if you're a, let's say you're a volunteer ambulance service, or you're an ambulance service and you have folks who respond to ambulance calls, but some of those folks were out fundraising for your ambulance service. And let's say those folks were paid, or you would want, or they had hours tied to fundraising, that would be listed in this third column. Okay, so total hours of compensation for paid EMT response staff, right? Total hours worked annually for paid EMT response staff. And then if a subset of their hours were not related to ground ambulance, fundraising, for example, is a great example of that. Then you would list that in here if you capture that information. If in fact you don't capture that information because they're not paid for that fundraising, then I suppose that's fine. But honestly, the more accurate you are, frankly, the better you are. And so you will work your way through this grid. And this is why it's important that you're able to identify and ensure that your reporting systems, your various reporting systems, whether they're payroll, and if you're a municipal agency and your payroll is done at your county government level or your city government, municipal government level, you're going to need to engage your folks in city or town hall or county, in your county offices, to make sure that you can get this information. All right, now compensation, what's included? All right, salary, wages, overtime, training time, standby time, benefits, that includes healthcare, PTO, retirement, stipends, life insurance. All right, if those costs are paid by somebody else, then you need to get those costs from somebody else. So for example, if you're in a municipal agency and your town is the one paying the retirement benefits for your firefighter EMTs, you're going to need to get that amount from your town. All right, question. What if you run fire and EMS? Do you have to split the time between EMS and fire calls? So what you're going to need to do are pull those hours that are related either partially or entirely to ground ambulance, and then those hours that are not. So if, let's say, for example, and you may need to do this through an allocation method, if your fire suppression folks also have EMS gear on their apparatus and they are responding to ground ambulance calls, and let's say 50 or 60, more likely these days, probably 60 or 70% of the responses on your engine are probably tied to ground ambulance calls. You can allocate in that instance. I mean, because honestly, trying to track those hours would be painful. So if you have an engine where those folks are supporting either entirely or partially related to ground ambulance, and 60 or 65% of those calls that they respond to over the course of the reporting period are in fact EMS calls, then you can use an allocation method. What I would suggest is, though, that you make sure that you document the rationale or the basis for the allocation method. And Brian, you can jump in here if you think I'm wandering too far off the path, but use an allocation method. So go ahead, you can look, see if 65% of your calls for your engine 3, let's say, for example, were tied to EMS, and then the other remaining 35% were tied to fire. Well, then you can allocate 65% of the wages and hours are tied to EMS, and 35% of the wages and hours are unrelated to ground ambulance. Does that make sense, David? I hope that answers the question. If not, just drop another question into the Q&A. All right, so again, for administrative folks, you will go through that exact same process. So, and they provide several examples through the various Medicare Learning Network open door forums that they did. Again, the good news with those is you can start them and then you can pause them and go back, not like a presentation like this where you might have missed something. You can go through, because they're pre-recorded. Andrew from RAND, who did most of these presentations, did an unbelievable job. And what I'll say is, do yourself a favor, go to the ambulance services page when you're getting to, as you're working your way through the tool, to make sure you understand it. If you run into issues, grab those pre-recorded webinars. You can certainly also grab, as you subscribe to Amber, you also get access to all the educational content from the AAA. And in addition, I think as part of that grant, if I'm not mistaken, Sam, there was a point at which there was some AAA membership that was involved in that, which got you access to all of the consultants. But what I'd suggest is, this is important. So, we're certainly not going to not answer your question because you might not be a AAA member. So please reach out to us. But that being said, go on, you can watch these webinars as you work through and pause and then go back to the tool. And honestly, they did an amazing job. So one of the questions that they're going to ask, and I'll get to the volunteer labor in just a minute, labor administrative facilities, you're going to go through, they're going to ask you, did any one of your staff devote at least 20 hours to any of the following: billing, data analysis, training, or QA? All right, so this gets back to, if you're an entity that ended up, everybody does ambulance calls, this is where they're going to catch, okay, we recognize that in fact, while they reported that they had no admin staff, they did answer this question in a way that said, hey, someone spent at least 20 hours throughout the course of the reporting period on billing, training, data analysis, etc. Now, for public safety organizations, all right, again, this comes right out of the March 12th, 2020 CMS Medicare Learning Network Open Door Forum. Again, they really do a nice job in this particular Open Door Forum program in with public safety, because it gets very, very confusing with public safety entities. So they provide a lot of algorithms here. So part-time volunteer EMT basic who responds only to ground ambulance calls, but assists with other administrative duties. You're going to choose that relevant category. So EMT basic without fire public safety role. If you have an EMT intermediate who only has ground ambulance responsibilities, again, same thing. If you have a paid administrative staff that work with all aspects of the organization, you would choose with relevant public police public safety role option. All right. So they do a really nice job. I don't know what the underlying tool will look like, but we're hopeful that they incorporate some of these algorithms into that tool. So here is where you're then going to, again, list for public safety. They want to know EMT paid response, compensation, hours, and then how many hours did they work that were unrelated to ground ambulance service. Now, the volunteer labor question, all right, they are going to ask how many EMT response staff volunteer for your service, what categories are they in, and how many hours did they volunteer or work during the typical week. What I would suggest is, and this is part of why we're out there talking to folks, if you utilize volunteer labor, my call fire department, we did track time because we were a call fire department. The time was tracked from the time the tone went off to when the officer cleared everyone from the station at the end of the call, following us cleaning up the truck, getting everything sealed back up so that we could leave. What I would say is you are going to need to track your volunteer hours. How you do that, that is up to you. But for those organizations that currently utilize volunteer labor, if you're not tracking any hours, you're going to need to do that and make sure that you document how you do it. So you will have to then go in here and fill out EMT basic without fire public safety responsibilities, etc. Now, they will ask, again, volunteer hours. They don't want time on call. They don't want time spent fundraising. They don't want time not actually working. They only want, hours worked related, either partially or entirely, to ground ambulance service. So here they provide an example where they say, I'm an EMT basic. That EMT basic number 1 did 500 hours during the data collection period, only had ground ambulance responsibilities. EMT 2 had 750 during the collection period, had 250 that were related to community education and outreach. So in other words, not ground ambulance. So here you'd have 1250 of those related to ground ambulance, and then 250 related to so those hours unrelated to ground ambulance duties. Now, they will ask how many were administrative or facility volunteers during the year. They don't want admin staff who actually also do ambulance calls. A lot of times in volunteer services, the folks who are managing the service or who are doing any of the administrative stuff are also field providers and respond to ground ambulance calls. They want the total number of administrative hour volunteer hours during the reporting year, the total number of medical director volunteer hours, and then did you provide any stipends, honoraria, benefits for volunteer labor? Now, and I'm going to ask Brian to come back up on the screen for this one. When you ask about stipends, so, and what I would suggest is if you have a per call stipend for your folks, I would report that, unless Brian, you disagree with me, because they ask about stipends, but they don't actually.
I would report it. I agree.
Yeah, I would. So they ask about stipends, but they don't tell you where to report it. I would report it in compensation. So again, so if you're going to need to track that stuff because it is a form of compensation. So I would report it in the hours. I would report it in the compensation. And again, so they asked, do you provide stipends, honorary benefits for volunteer labor? That's a simple yes or no question. So that what they're looking for is, as you report that you had volunteer labor or hours, while we recognize, right, that you may pay some stipend, it probably doesn't reach the level of paying them an hourly wage that's at least minimum wage. And as a result, they really are a volunteer. The way they define volunteer is anyone who isn't paid at least hourly, a minimum wage. So I hope that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing, Scott, I would add is if it's some de minimis amount in the grand scheme of things, it may be worth it to just sort of wink at it. If it's significant enough in the overall cost structure, again, to Scott's point that they don't really tell you where to list it, it would almost require you to then convert those individuals to paid staff, right, in order to report it. So just be mindful of that. This is, you know, a work in progress in terms of what they're asking for here.
And just one quick thing before I pass it off to Brian to pick up at the facilities piece. Don't go it alone, right? I mean, the bottom line is there's more than enough of us, and Brian and I spend most of our days answering questions for fire, private, police, nonprofit, I mean, all over the country. We spend the majority of our days answering questions for folks relative to this and a whole bunch of other stuff. What we'd say is, because there are resources, don't wing it. If a surgeon walked in just before they knocked you under and said, and you're like, okay, doc, what's the plan? He says, I'm just going to wing it. You would not be comfortable. What we're saying is, this is important. Don't wing it. Reach out to us. There is literally no excuse for not asking for assistance, whether that be through your billing agent who has been kind enough to put this on and is really staying on top of it, or whether you reach out through the American Ambulance Association. We're never going to turn you away, because we recognize this is part of why AAA spent hundreds of thousands of dollars developing Amber and then decided to give it away, because they recognized, again, we'll be judged by the worst of us. So I'm going to pass it off to Brian. Brian, you've got control again for Section 8 facilities.
All right. And frankly, just if you're experiencing an issue where there's no real good way to put it in this tool, chances are there are other entities out there that are experiencing similar issues. The stipends is a great example. If we hear from enough entities that this is a concern, it puts us in a position to go to CMS to ask for clarity on how they want that answered, right? So, all right. So by far, labor is the largest section in the tool. Probably the next largest section deals with facilities. So what they're asking here are all of those physical facilities that you use that are either entirely or partly related to your ground ambulance operations. But, and this is important, they are not asking about any facility used by a contractor of yours. So in the extreme example where you are an ambulance authority, but you contract out the actual provision of EMS to another entity, and it is responsible for maintaining its own physical space, vehicles, et cetera, you would have no reporting obligations here. Where you maintain your own fire stations, and that station has both engines and ambulances, that's what they're asking about here. So in the first section of the tool, they will ask you to list each of the facilities that you maintain, and then they will ask you to name them. Now, those names are for your internal use only, so you can call them whatever you want: headquarters, station 1, station 2, etc. For each of those facilities that you name, though, they will then ask for information on your ownership of it. Do you lease it? Yes or no? Do you own it? Yes or no? Do you own it but pay a mortgage on it? Yes or no, right? Or was the facility donated to you? They will ask you for the approximate square footage of the facility. And then they will ask you to allocate what percentage of that facility is related to ground ambulance provisions as opposed to other uses such as public safety, fire, right? This is, again, where we get down to an allocation methodology. Here's just one example of how they calculate the space. The basic premise here is a fire engine is larger than an ambulance, and therefore, even if the total numbers of vehicles are the same, proportionally more of that space is going to be devoted to parking the fire engines than the ambulances. There is no right or wrong answer here in terms of how you allocate. Really, this is just applying common sense. And then they give another example for how we would allocate space within an administrative building. So for where that building does both, the billing for your EMS and, the operational areas of your fire suppression. Again, no right answer. This will really require you to just from the start sort of come up with the percentages. Those percentages will then follow through as we go through the rest of the facility section. For each section, they are then or for each facility, excuse me, they're then going to ask you, and again, what you're seeing in the blue there is what will populate based on how you answered for each facility, whether you own it, lease it, own it outright, et cetera. So if you lease it, they're going to ask you for the rental payments on that facility. If you own it, but pay mortgage on it, they're going to ask you for the mortgage payments on that facility. If you own it outright and are depreciating it, they're going to ask you for depreciation, right? And then to the extent there are no actual costs, either because it was donated and or you own it outright, they'll then ask you to check a box if there are no carrying costs on that facility. Then they will ask you about the insurance, the maintenance, the utilities, et cetera, on each of those facilities. So they're going to ask you for a total amount and then the percentage that's associated with ground ambulance. So again, we're going back to those allocation percentages that you previously decided upon. And strong recommendation that before you start filling in the amounts, we first come up with those percentages and then carry them through. It will definitely make your life a lot easier. Next, they will turn to the vehicle costs. They will ask how many ground ambulance vehicles your organization owns. This is all ambulances, whether they are on the road or not. So if there's an old ambulance that's sitting on the back of the lot that's up on cinder blocks, you would count that here if you own it. Any vehicle you lease would also be reported. They're going to ask you for the total number of miles traveled by water ambulance for any given reporting period. I can give you the answer to that. It will be 0. They will also ask you a similar one when we get down a little bit for the mileage traveled by your ambulances. If you depreciate your vehicles, they're going to ask you for the annual depreciation expense. This number you're going to get from your accountants if you are an entity that files tax returns, or for-profit entity that takes depreciation expenses as a deduction against income taxes, or if you are a governmental entity and you depreciate. It's unusual, I understand, but you would likely get this from the town finance department. They may be claiming tax credits or other governmental payments on it. Transfer payments, excuse me. Whoop. Sorry, it's jumping here on me. Leased vehicles. If you reported that you lease any vehicles, it will ask you for the lease payments, the total lease costs of all of those vehicles in any given year. And then it will ask you again for the depreciation expense. One thing though is as we get into the specific vehicles, here is where it will ask you whether or not a particular vehicle was actually used to provide ambulance services during the particular year. So while you'll report every vehicle that you own or lease, you will only list the information for each particular vehicle to the extent it was used during the year to provide ambulance services. So that truck that's on the back of the lot up on cinder blocks, you would answer no to the question for whether or not you used it in that particular year. Oops, Scott, I seem to be frozen. Oh, there we go. All right. Did you own, it will now ask you about non-ambulance vehicles next. So this is any vehicle that you use, regardless of whether you purchased it, leased it, it was gifted or donated to you, that's used to respond to ground ambulance calls or otherwise support your ground ambulance operations. So this is intended to be interpreted broadly, right? That is not otherwise an ambulance under your state law. And then it will ask you for the number of those that are leased versus the number of those that are owned. And this is basically, Scott's used the phrase, anything with an engine in it. So this can be your fire trucks. This can be supervisor vehicles, Ford Explorers, et cetera, right? But this can also be, I'm a city boy, so I'm gonna need some of you to help me out, but you know, those Gators or those off-road vehicles that you use, if you're in a rural area and you typically respond to areas that do not have roads, state parks, national parks, et cetera, right? Any one of those vehicles, if it's got an engine, you're going to report in it here, whether you own it or lease it. Oh, and again, I'm frozen here. All right. Now it's going to ask you for the total miles traveled by each of these non-ambulance land vehicles, and then whether or not you depreciate it. So One word of advice here is on whatever the first date is of your reporting period, be that a calendar year or a fiscal year, based on what you've answered above, my strong recommendation would be to take the odometer reading for that vehicle and then read it again at the end of the year, and that will give you the mileage traveled during the year, especially for those road vehicles. If it's a non-road vehicle, the all-terrain vehicles, the Gators, et cetera, really, they're just looking for an estimate here. There is no right or wrong answer in terms of how you come up with that estimate. It will also ask you for non-ambulance water vehicle miles. So if you use boats to patrol rivers or whatever, you're gonna have to come up with some way of calculating how much distance it traveled. Again, it's going to be an estimate here.
Yeah, we got a question, just how do you handle vehicles purchased throughout the year? Are they included? And the answer would be yes. So if you picked up a vehicle mid-year, you would include that vehicle. Now, if you replace the vehicle, Brian, you want to touch on what they do when they, so if, let's say, for example,
Both vehicles, each of them would obviously travel less mileage in the year because, right. So now for each type of vehicle, it's going to ask you again whether or not it's used to respond to ground ambulance vehicles. It's again going to ask you about the depreciation. And again, it's going to ask you to differentiate that mileage, which was attributable to ground ambulance response versus non-ambulance response. So again, this is likely going to be an allocation percentage that you're going to use. It's going to be unlikely that we're going to be in a position to track this, right? But
an allocation is fine, right? I think it would, the goal of cost collection is to get as fair a representation of what it costs to furnish ground ambulance services. So just make sure that you document the formula or the logic for your allocation, so that while I don't think there is going to be a very strong likelihood of any sort of audit or anything like that, you do want to recognize that, one, if you have to go back and do this again 3 or 4 years from now, you don't want to have to go reinvent the wheel, number one. But number two, in the event that someone does come in and question how you got to the numbers you got, you want to be able to, the best indicator is what you thought at the time that you did it. Because I promise you, if you're like me, you won't remember what the heck you were doing last week.
yeah, really, to the extent they're going to do any quote auditing of this, what they're really looking for is outliers, extreme outliers. So either a situation where you've just put in numbers that don't make sense. You forgot the decimal place, right? Or a situation where you're taking an inappropriately aggressive position on, say, depreciation, right? We bought a $250,000 ambulance and we claimed the entire expense in year one, even though it has a usable life of many, many years, right? So that they can allocate that cost over a period of time to come up with what the actual costs are to you to operate that ambulance, right? If it costs $250,000 and has a 5-year usable life, they would allocate $50,000 of that cost to each year. Since you're only reporting for a particular year, that's what they'd be looking at, would be to make sure that you didn't claim all of the expenses in the reporting year. This is not going to be a situation where we intend to deceive. It's going to be one where there are situations where you are allowed to fully depreciate vehicles in the first year, right? That's really what they're trying to get at here. The last section in the facility and vehicle cost section deals with registration, licensing, and insurance costs. So these are all of the other costs that are associated with operating these vehicles. You can get this straight from your payments to the DMV for the registrations, the licensing, right? Or from your insurance carrier. Again, be mindful of the fact that in any given year, you will pull some vehicles off the road and put new ones on, right? So just make sure that you're tracking if there's any supplemental payments and or any credits that you get from either the state or your insurer based on changes over the year. But this should be a relatively straightforward calculation. Then they're going to ask you about what is the total maintenance cost of all the vehicles. And Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is those costs that you do not contract out, correct?
Yes. So if you pay a third-party garage or maintenance facility to do your maintenance, those are, well, actually, let me think about that. I've got to go back, Brian, and take a peek, because there's a spot, I think you're reporting. So actually, let me put this right. in this section, you're going to report the actual costs. Now, if this is not the labor, so if for example, you have your own maintenance folks, labor is reported in the labor section in the under facilities, administrative facilities, but the other costs and or if you fully outsource it are going to be reported here.
Right.
All right. But so not the labor.
The labor for your own internal maintenance staff would be captured in the labor section. So this would be the actual out-of-pocket costs for parts, et cetera, right? Then, and they're going to ask you then
The percentage break those
the percentage for each of the various vehicles, right? So for those of you, this will the bulk of this would presumably be your ambulances and your fire trucks, with relatively smaller percentages allocated to those other vehicles. Then they're going to ask you about fuel cost. This is one that we spend a lot of time on in our in-person sessions. We're going to just try and avoid that. They're asking you for a total, and then they're going to ask you to break it down by percentages for the ambulances, the fire trucks, and the other forms of vehicles. Again, this is one of those ones where there is no right or wrong way. So you'll know how you pay for your fuel, right? If you issue gas cards to your employees, it will be the sum total of all of those charges, right? Where you're a municipal entity and you're allowed to fill up at the town pump, that's where this gets somewhat more complicated. In reality, it's going to require you to go to the town and get some metric for how many total gallons you've used, right? And then apply a cost to that. So yes, you can look up the average cost of fuel, for the various diesel, gas, et cetera, over the year, and just apply a metric like that. If you happen to know it to the penny, even better. But in the grand scheme of things, this will be a relatively small piece of the total cost structure. So don't make yourself nuts over this.
Yeah, although over the last year, we've seen fuel prices go crazy.
It's
The
a
fact of the
larger
matter is-
percentage today than it was a year ago, no doubt, but it is still a relatively small percentage. in
Yeah,
the grand
and
scheme of
the
things.
important thing is these are numbers that are knowable. So in other words, if you're filling up with the municipal tanks, your municipality knows exactly how many gallons, at least in my fire department, we did, but knows how many gallons you got and can allocate a cost based upon, I promise you, there's a line item budget item in there, for you. And so you should be able to get those numbers. So I'll pick up here, Brian, on section 10, and then, maybe you can close us out with the revenue section, because that's more likely what you'll be able to pull that. That's like
Okay.
right in your wheelhouse. So anyways, I'm just trying to flip my remote control back to me, and my computer is doing some funky stuff. All right, so equipments, consumables, and supplies. All right, so they're looking here for all of the stuff that's not your vehicles, your labor, or your facilities. All right, we're talking about everything else. So in this instance, I'm just taking back over remote control. So they're going to look for those capital expenditures, medical, non-medical, etc. All right, so let me just jump. All right, so there were some proposed changes to the way that you do depreciation. So if your organization is one that does depreciation, you're to use whatever depreciation method that your organization uses. All right, that just, again, this is one of those instances in which I would absolutely notate that somewhere as to what your formula is, but you should have that. So as we get into these on equipment and consumables, so you're going to have both your capital equipment and your non-capital equipment. So they're looking particularly your medical equipment, those cardiac monitors, stretchers, all of the equipment that you need in your typical ground ambulance service, those maintenance costs, contracts that you often have for preventive maintenance, the services, etc. They are going to seek, and that's for all of your capital medical equipment. That's the stuff that gets reused. They are going to also ask for medications separately. I'm not exactly sure why they did this, but I think because we did see over the last couple of years, especially during the EpiPen issue where drug prices went crazy, I think frankly they saw a strong need that if they were going to be building a cost collection system,
It's a volatility issue. They recognize that the consumables are more volatile.
Yeah. And so then when we get down to your consumable medical supplies, and this should be relatively easy for you to pull, all right, understanding what your costs are for those things that you generally only use one time and toss. Now they do include in here blood pressure cuffs, which I know we use multiple times, but you don't tend to capitalize those. So what they're looking for is all other consumable type medical costs, and that should be a gettable number. That's a technical term, gettable. Now they're going to ask for all of your non-medical equipment, both capital and non-capital. So they're going to ask for your, phone systems, dispatch computers, your filing cabinets, your desks, your bunks, all of the stuff that's associated with your ground ambulance service. That is not medical equipment. So that'll be the stuff that's inside your stations, your computers, etc. Now, again, the non-capital, non-medical equipment, which is even like paper clips, they are going to ask for all of that information as well. Again, if you're a municipal agent, this should be pretty straightforward for you to be able to pull those line items right out of your expenditures or out of your budget. Separately, they are going to ask about uniforms. And that, I think, is actually a good thing, because uniforms are a huge cost, in particular in public safety related. My fire department, we always had to wear our turnout gear because many of us were coming from home. And so we just threw on our turnout gear. Turnout gear, of course, is incredibly pricey. Now, the last cost section, well, not last cost section, second to last cost section, are all of those other costs. So, for example, if you utilize a billing service, if you utilize an accounting service, vehicle repair, outsourced vehicle repair maintenance service, dispatch call center, facilities maintenance, IT, if you happen to contract out labor, which some folks do. So if you contract out like temporary labor, let's say, for example, I do know of, believe it or not, temporary paramedic staffing services. If you contract out labor, you'd report that here, not in the labor section. Okay. So this is labor section would be anybody.
The good rule of thumb is if you're issuing a W-2 to the individual, they go in labor. If you're issuing a 1099, it goes here.
And then they're going to ask and leave a bunch of lines open for other, which they're going to ask you to specify, in which case you would need to check off that, in fact, you use that, and then enter the dollar amount. And then if in fact you're going to have to make some allocation on the percentage of that dollar figure that is attributable to your ground ambulance services. This is why we talk to you about this now, so that you can set your systems up now and be prepared to be able to report this information. Now, this has got a lot of stuff on here, okay? They're gonna ask you, let's see, biohazardous waste medication removal fees. Do you have any? So they're looking for a yes or a no answer here. All right, again, this sets you up to be able to report potentially some of those as you move forward. So fees to physicians to oversee paramedics. So if, for example, you have affiliate medical hospital that you pay a fee to for medical direction, then you would just check yes. Administrative costs, travel, training, organizational dues, subscriptions, if you belong to an association. I see that there's a question, I'll get that in a second. Funds paid to other ambulance organizations for paramedic staff or subcontracted ambulance services, funds paid to non-transporting services, overhead, allocation from a parent organization, if there were one, any board of directors, trustee expenses, advertising, etc. You get through, and as you move down, you'll see fees, fines paid, 911 service fees, other regulatory license fees, and liability, malpractice insurance, workers' compensation insurance, only if it's not included in compensation above. So if you do it, don't report it in both places, and that's true throughout. Don't report it in both places, only report it in one place. Physicals, recruiting, auditing fees, etc. So again, if you reported a cost somewhere else, don't report it here. Do EMS items reimbursed or replaced by another entity count towards cost? Example, medications are replaced by the hospital, items purchased or reimbursed through grant funds. Brian, do you want to pick this one up?
Sure. So generally, they're only looking at true costs, meaning costs you've actually incurred. So in a situation where you've got a replenishing agreement with a hospital, say, the initial batch of drugs that you purchase, if you purchase them, then yes, you would claim those as a cost. But as those are consumed and then replenished by the hospital, you would be incurring no additional cost there. So there would be nothing to report, right?
Perfect.
A different way of saying that is only to the extent it's not otherwise reimbursed by some other entity, but that would imply not a replenishing so much as they handed you cash to go out and buy it, right?
Right.
In which case that technically probably should be reported as a cost for the supplies, but then the monies you get from the hospital to purchase those supplies would be reported as revenue later on.
All right, so I'll finish up these last two cost sections and I'll hand it up to Brian to close us out on the last section, section 13 for revenue. So they will ask you for other costs, and those are essentially any other cost that's not reflected earlier in the tool. They're going to ask you to identify what that cost is, what the amount is, and what percentage of that amount is attributable to ground ambulance. So once you take all of those other costs and add them up, that will equal section 12, which is where you will put in your total cost number. If in fact there's an error, in other words, those numbers don't match, you are going to get notified. One of the things Amber does as well is the same sort of logic that sort of keeps you honest, right? Or it tells you that you're missing a cost or that something doesn't match up. So here in section 12, 11 is any other cost not represented somewhere else in the tool. And then 12 is what is your total cost to run your ground ambulance service? Now, those numbers should match up. If they don't match up, well, then you've got a different issue. So now for the last section, and hopefully arguably the easiest section, Brian's going to take us through revenues.
Yeah, so we've been talking for 115 minutes at this point, all about the cost portion of the ledger. Only now at the end, the last couple of minutes, are we going to talk about revenues, and that's probably going to be a fairly good representation of what you'll experience as you actually go through trying to track these things. The other thing I would mention is this is where your billing agent will really become a true asset to you. So on the revenue side, what they're asking you to do is to report all of your revenue from any source during the year. And they also want you to include any revenues that you get that are not otherwise related to ground ambulance services. So for instance, if you provide extrication as part of your fire response and bill for that, those would be included as revenues, right? They will then separately ask you to clarify those revenues that are directly responsible from ground ambulance operations. They will also want you to break it out by category. And this is where we may need to update our systems a little bit. It is not uncommon for Medicare Advantage, Medicare Part C, or Medicaid managed care, because they are administered by private insurance companies. Blue Cross Blue Shield has a Medicare Advantage product. United Healthcare has a Medicare Advantage product. For that to either be lumped into your Medicare, big heading, both Part B and Part C, or to get lumped in with general commercial insurance, all United Healthcare, all Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? In order to do this correctly, it's critical that you distinguish between Medicare Part B and Medicare Part C, and at the same time, Blue Cross Medicare versus Blue Cross Commercial, right? So you're going to want to make sure that you're set up before we start the reporting period, if that's 2022 for you, so that you can properly characterize them now. And this should be relatively simple, because I'm assuming most billing systems are set up, even if it might be lumped under when we report a general heading, there is a separate payer type for Blue Cross Blue Shield Medicare as opposed to just Blue Cross Blue Shield. For that matter, there's probably multiple different payer types for the various types of Blue Cross entities or plans that you would typically encounter.
That's also important when you're setting up any of your workers' comp, because that is asked to be detailed out here. And I know often travelers, for example, you may not know whether that's a comp or an auto. It's important that you have those set up that way.
They're then going to ask you the single dumbest question by far in the entire section, and that is, for each payer type, they're going to ask you, quote, how often did you try to bill the following payer type? And the options are never, sometimes, usually, or always, right? I know the answer is never going to be never, and the answer will never be always, but sometimes versus usually, I don't know what they mean, right? I mean, So really just probably put sometimes for all of them and move on. Then they're going to get to non-traditional sources of revenue. And it's a little tough to see on the screen, I'm sure. It's going to ask you about basically anything that doesn't involve billing and insurance. And I'm trying to enlarge it on my screen and I'm not having much success here. So the biggest line item will likely be contract revenue. So this will be those situations where you bill a facility, either, for instance, a prison for patients that are in custody, right? Or for a healthcare facility, a hospital or a nursing home, either because under the rules of the payer, Medicare or Medicaid, it's bundled to that facility, or because contractually they are the payer, right? Maybe they're a payer of last resort. If you subcontract ambulance services, meaning you are the subcontractor, right? So an entity hires you to provide ambulance services and they pay you a fee, you would report that fee here. That's distinguished slightly from fees that are paid by standby events. So if the local high school hires you to stand by at a football game and pays you, that would go in the section for standby events. If you're subcontracted, maybe the town next door pays you a fee to provide mutual aid, that's where that would go, right? If you pay a subcontractor, that goes in the expense side of the ledger, right? If you run a membership subscription program, that goes here. Charitable donations are included here, but it does not include vehicles. So this is actual cash donations or cash equivalents. You know, if you take securities or stock shares or anything that can be readily convertible into cash, Bitcoin, et cetera, right? Executive loan programs, I'm assuming this is going to be a no for the vast majority of us. So this would be a situation where you lend your CEO money, they pay it back with interest, the interest would go here, right? Investments, local taxes is a big one for those of you that are public entities. So if you get a subsidy as a private entity, or if you get a millage as a public entity, you would report that in this section. Enterprise funds, if you sold capital assets during the year, that gets reported here. If you issued a bond, if you're a taxing district, right? The proceeds of the bond would come here, right? Any other, it is a long list.
It's anything
And-
that's not really, anything that's not reimbursed through one of your payer insurance, right? So in other words, your insurance, your other payers, private payer, whatever, that you're going to be reporting monies in. So if you sell a vehicle, whatever it is, you're going to need to report those dollars. The reason why we're showing you this list now is that you understand in your accounting software or wherever else in your systems that you have, whether they be even a spreadsheet, that you're able to identify those so that you can appropriately report them. Most important thing is that you don't report anything twice. So make sure that you're reporting it once. If it ends up in the wrong category, that's less problematic than reporting it twice, but you'd like to be as accurate as you can. So one thing that I want to do, a couple of questions. I had a couple of questions. One is the question earlier about allocating HR expenses. So if, for example, if you have individuals who, so if your HR is handled by your municipality, let's say, like your town has so very few fire departments have their own HR person. So the hiring and all that stuff is managed usually through their town HR. You are going to need to get that administrative payroll. Those are individuals who typically don't have anything to do with responding to ground ambulance calls. You're going to need to go to your municipality and get the wages and the hours that are attributable to your department itself, right? So it's important that you recognize that, again, you're going to need to, while you may not have your own person, if the town has 200 employees and let's say 50 of those employees are on your fire department, then 25% of the HR person arguably is attributable, unless they have some other system that they can attribute how much time and money they're spending on your department staff. That's where you'd go about making sure that you're capturing that information, because otherwise it would look an awful lot like that you have lower costs than you really do. That's why we're talking about this now before you start next year, which is when your reporting period starts. Now, I had another question.
Before you go, I think we're about to revisit the question regarding fire and public safety. I think probably the easiest way to conceive of this is to imagine a fire department with a chief, right? The fire department also provides EMS. If the chief gets on a truck or otherwise participates in an EMS response in the year, they go under the EMS bucket, right? But clearly that chief would also have a fire, police, or public safety role. It's the aspect of his or her job that doesn't relate to the EMS, right? In a larger fire department, so I'm in New York, so I'm going to use the fire department of New York as an example. There is a commissioner who is the equivalent of a chief in smaller services. And then there are deputy chiefs. And in this case, there is one individual who is entirely responsible for fire suppression and another chief who is entirely responsible for EMS, right? The EMS chief would not have a fire, police, or public safety role because 100% of their job relates to FIDNY's EMS operations, right? Conversely, the other chief, the one that is involved with the fire suppression activities, would not be reported at all because he has no, or she has no involvement with EMS, right? But the chief, the ultimate commissioner, would have both, right? So really what it's asking is whether or not this person is exclusively EMS, exclusively fire, or a little bit of both. If they are exclusively EMS, they have no public safety role. If they are exclusively fire, they do not get reported at all, right? If they're both, then they go under that heading of with a responsibility for fire and public safety as well. And then you're responsible for allocating the percentage for that person.
Yep.
So citywide HR personnel, Scott, I'll let you handle this one, but
Yeah, no, this is again in that instance where let's say that you have you're part of a citywide department and you do not have your own individual HR person in your fire department, and a portion of the HR responsibility is provided by your city government, or your municipal government. You would need to go to that individual and identify what percentage or portion of their wages and hours are allocated to the management of your ground ambulance service. So this
Scott, I think, wouldn't we need to do two allocations? I think the first question we would need to ask that person is, what percentage of your time is spent on the fire department
yes,
as opposed to any other public entity?
Yep.
And then within that, then you would apply your normal allocation. So if you've decided that you're 60% EMS and 40% fire, then, right, if 50% of their time is devoted to you, then 50% of their salary gets allocated to the fire department. And then 60% of that 50% would be allocated to EMS operations.
Yep, that's exactly where I was going was, yep, it is. So you are going to need to engage your folks at City Hall. They should know about cost collection now rather than later. And frankly, remember, it is important that your costs are as accurate as possible, because I'm confident, one, that it is probably more expensive to run a fire-based EMS system or a municipal-based EMS system than it is to run a private, for-profit ambulance service. I have run 5 private for-profit, and I have worked for 16 years for a fire department. And I will tell you, the costs were very, very different. And so it's important that the only folks reporting are not the private EMS folks who maybe have a different cost structure. And as a result, it's important that all of our entities are reporting their costs as accurately as possible so that the cost of providing EMS services in this country is appropriately reimbursed. So with that said, one of the things—
Scott, before we go there, I realize we sort of omitted one major point, which is when will we report, right? So based on whether or not you told us whether you're a calendar year filer or a fiscal year filer, you go through a 12-month period that starts on the start of that period. So if you told, and it's Ohio, so Cigna, that you are a calendar year filer, you will need to capture your data for all of calendar year 2022 and report on it by May of 2023. Many of you, though, use a fiscal year. That fiscal year might start July 1st. If that's the case, then your 12-month period will run from July 1st, 2022 to June 30th of 2023. And you will then report 5 months later in November of 2023. So keep that in mind as you start to track this information. You may or may not be tracking it as of January. You may need to track it as of the start of your own fiscal year, right?
Yeah, we hit that briefly just at the very beginning, but I didn't hit it to that detail, and I think it's important.
Yeah, I was texted a question, so.
Yeah, no. I think it's really, really important to recognize that it's, if you're a calendar year, it follows the calendar. If you're a fiscal year, the year you've been selected, it's for the fiscal year starting in the year you've been selected to collect data, and then you will report 5 months after the end of that fiscal year. So here again are if this is an active link in the PDF presentation. If you have questions, submit those questions to hello@ambulance.org. That is our ticketing system. The questions come out to Brian and I and the other members from the ACE faculty staff. There are no stupid questions. This is really, really important. This is why the AAA has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in Amber to try and ensure that this is done and done well, because we, again, the group that reports data, we will all be judged by that group. So it's really important we get it right. So again, if you haven't already done so, go to SAVIC, become a member, apply for the grant. You will get the grant and you will get access to Amber. That allows you to start working through. There's a lot of explanations inside Amber. There's a lot of features in that program that will help you get this right. We'll also give you an opportunity to do it right before you actually have to submit the data. And hopefully we will have an application program interface or some very, very easy way to be able to kick a report out that will be able to be uploaded right into Amber. Quick question, funny, but if the federal government tracked their records as we are being asked, I will agree with you on that one. And needless to say, it's funny how they're seeking for our cost, and they're quite convinced that they're reimbursing us. If you ask your typical governmental person right now, they'll tell you that we're getting everything that we should have, and probably too much. And the fact of the matter is you and I and everyone else who work in this profession know that's not the case. So a couple of things. One, I want to thank Kim and Katie for inviting us on today. Your billing agent is going to be a huge part of, while they don't own all of it. So you can't per se, right? They, as you saw, the revenue piece really is the part that your billing agent has. Now, some billing agents are trying to be able to capture more of this. Either way, involving your billing agent is going to be critical. And you've got one that clearly cared enough to be able to put on a program to make sure that you're getting it right. That, by the way, is step number one, is making sure that you have an entity that is willing, ready, willing, and able to put forth the time, energy, and money to make sure that you get this right. So I want to thank both Kim and Katie, and I don't know if they want to come back up on to be able to say a few final words, but I want to thank them for asking us to come. We will come anytime you ask us, that's for sure, and appreciate. We prefer live, honestly, but we'll take what we can get, because we know that for a lot of folks, I've had my booster, but for a lot of folks, it's a tough time to be out traveling. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Katie and Kim. And guys, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and happy to do this again anytime, but we appreciate the time. And we know cost collection is not the sexiest thing out there, but try and make it at least as interesting as it possibly can be. So thank you. All right, well, the recording of this, I'm going to presume maybe, actually, I don't know if we recorded this, and I probably should know that. So I will check in with Samantha, who I'm going to guess, actually, maybe I'll hand it back over to Sam to close us out. Sam, do you have any final closing words?
Actually, we're going to jump in here really quick.
Oh, please do.
Yeah. And we definitely want to thank both of you for your time today. We felt like it was a excellent presentation, and it is being recorded, by the way, so we will be sending this out at some point later today or tomorrow morning. And we hope everyone was able to ask all the questions that they had, but it's great that you guys gave them the opportunity to send you questions as well. We actually learned some things ourselves. So we'll probably be sending you some questions too. So, but we appreciate everybody participating today, and we do hope this was very helpful. You have anything else to add?
No, I just like to thank you all for being here. Thanks, Scott and Brian, for a plethora, obviously, of information, probably way more information than some people were expecting. But that's kind of what this is about. And for everybody's time and attention. I know everybody's really busy, and we just thought it was that important that we bring this front and center when we know everybody on this call actually today is going to be in that next round of reporting, or the very first round.
Right.
So they were all either year one or year two clients, or they were
Right, they're in it for sure.
so,
It's quite-
so thanks everybody. And obviously, yeah, follow up with us here at Great Lakes Billing with any billing related questions, but anything else that you think we can focus on that would help all of our providers as well.
All right, take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
guys. Thanks so much. Hope you have a good
Thank you,
holiday.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.